Good evening, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear Chantal Mouffe. I'm really happy to see that we are in our full capacity here tonight. Welcome at the continuation of the Kyiv International 68 Now, dedicated to the political and cultural heritage of the revolt and struggle of 68 in Europe. And first of all, let me express again my deep thankfulness to Chantal Mouffe for your presence here. Thanks so much for coming to Kyiv. My name is Vasil Cherepan and I represent Visual Culture Research Center, the organizer of the 68 Now project. And last week, at the opening weekend, we concentrated, at least those of you who attended the events could remember, we concentrated mainly on the relationship between the political and cultural actions and the city space in the context of the French 68. And this weekend we will discuss the political significance of passions or strong emotions and how they were played out in the context of the Prague 68 during the Prague Spring. And today it's my great honor to introduce our notable speaker, a Belgian theorist, political theorist Chantal Mouffe, who is first of all known for the book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, which she co-authored with Ernesto Laclau back in 1985, and which is basically a post-Marxist political inquiry drawing on Gramsci, post-structuralism and theories of identity, and also redefining leftist politics in terms of radical democracy. A prominent critic of deliberative democracy, Chantal Mouffe is also known for her critical use of the work of Carl Schmitt, mainly the concept of the political, in proposing a radicalization of modern democracy, what she calls agonistic pluralism. She has also developed interest in highlighting radical political potential of artistic practices. Chantal Mouffe has worked in many universities in Europe, North America and Latin America, and has held research positions at Harvard, Cornell, the University of California, the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, at the Center for Scientific Research in Paris, and during the period of 1989 and 1995, she served as program directress at the International College of Philosophy in Paris. She currently holds a professorship at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster in the United Kingdom, where she directs the Center for the Study of Democracy. And Chantal Mouffe is notably the author of, and I'm naming just a few of her books, The Return of the Political, The Democratic Paradox, On the Political, Agonistics, Thinking the World Politically, Podemos, In the Name of the People, which she wrote together with Inigo Errejon, and the last upcoming books in Verso next month for the left populism. In this lecture entitled The Effects of Democracy, Chantal Mouffe will examine the crucial role played by passions in politics, which unfortunately are currently used mostly by right-wing populists, and also will scrutinize the role of artistic practices in creating the effects that can be mobilized in order to create a collective will able to give a new vigor to the democratic ideal. So, welcome Chantal Mouffe, The Effects of Democracy. Please give our speaker tonight a very warm welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vasil, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you to have come so numerous to listen to me. I hope that it will not to be too uncomfortable. And I'm very glad to be in Minsk, in Kiev, and it's my very first time here. Okay, so I'm going to inquire about the role of affects in politics. It in fact become a very fashionable topic recently because there's There's talk about an affective turn in social science, and it's something which is rather new, because for a long time it was an aspect that was not very much taken into account by sociologists and in the field of social science. My position, in fact, one of the things I want to do here is to clarify my position in this debate, because I've been for a long time already in my work talking about what I call the role of passion in politics. And so, in fact, people ask me, well, why do you speak of passion and not of emotion? Because not everybody is speaking about emotion. I'm going to clarify that and explain to you why I think that if we are thinking of politics, the term of passion is much more adequate than the term of emotion. Let me insist precisely to begin with on this point. Why I think that it is from the perspective that I am advocating, it's essential, I think, to distinguish between passion and emotion. And this is why, I really don't use of course, I'm not saying that, emotion is not also something important, but for the political perspective, I think passion is particularly important. And it is with regard to the political domain that my approach has been elaborated. And one of its central tenets is that in this field, the field of politics, we are always dealing with collective identities, something that I think that the term emotion does not adequately convey, because emotion is usually attached to individuals. Well, to be sure, passion can also be of an individual nature, but I have chosen to use the term passion because I think it's allowed me to underline the dimension of conflict, and in fact I recognize that passion has got some kind of more violent connotation than emotion, and this is precisely something which I like, because it is something that allows me to underline this dimension of conflict, which is central to my perspective, and to suggest a confrontation between collective political identities, two aspects which I take to be constitutive of politics. We are dealing with collective identities in politics, and we are dealing with confrontation between collective political identities. And I think that speaking of passion conveys that better than emotion. But to grasp what I understand by passion and how I see their role in politics, requires to be acquainted with the theoretical perspective that inform my approach. And this is why I'm going to start by recalling the main line of my conception of the political. Okay. Maybe, I don't know, some of you might be familiar with it or with some of its aspects, but of course I can't take for granted that all of you are, and this is why I think it's important to tell you exactly from where I'm speaking, from which theoretical perspective. Well, I have in my work suggested to distinguish between the political and politics. By the political, I refer to the dimension of antagonism, which is present in human societies. For me, it's a characteristic of human societies that there are antagonism. Antagonism that can emerge within a large variety of social relations. And this is another difference between my approach and the one of Marxism, because of course Marxists do recognize the existence of antagonism, but for them it's mainly class antagonism. And this is why they believe that when we will arrive to a society when there is no more class antagonism, then antagonism will have disappeared. And my position is that antagonism is something which is ineradicable. It will always be antagonism, and I will come to that a little bit later. But that's to refer to this dimension I call the political. The political is precisely the characteristic that there is always an ineradicable dimension of antagonism in human societies. On the other side, there is what I call politics, and by that I refer to human activities whose aim is to establish an order and organize human coexistence, but under conditions that are always traversed, so to speak, by the political, and that's why there are conditions which are always conflictual. We found, in fact, this distinction between the political and politics in other theories. I don't pretend in any way to be the first in making this distinction, but it's not always with the same signification. Well, for instance, some of you certainly have come to the talk of Jacques Rancière recently. Jacques Rancière also speaks about, in French, le politique. But he understands by that something very different from what I speak about the politique. But you also le politique. I mean, so this can be a bit confusing, because we use the same term but to refer to different things. So, I think there are, in fact, those. To basically to clarify a little bit this distinction, we can distinguish two opposing ways of characterizing the political. There are those for whom the political refer to the space of liberty and common action. So this is the political is when we are in terms of trying to act in common. And that is called the associative conception of the political. And there is another conception of the political, which is to say that the political refers to the dimension of conflict and antagonism. So of course it is also acting in common, but acting in common in conditions which are always conflictual. And this is of course the main difference. And of course the thesis that I defend is that one needs to understand the political as a dimension of conflict and antagonism, and that it is only when the ineradicable character of division and antagonism is recognized that it is possible to think in a properly political manner and to be in condition to face the challenge confronting democratic politics. This is really at the center of my approach. Taking account of the dimension of the political signifies acknowledging the existence of conflict that cannot have a rational solution. This is exactly what antagonism means, because antagonism is not simply conflict. Antagonism is a conflict that cannot have a rational solution. There is, in the confrontation, there is always necessarily one side which is need to win. I think that it's not characteristic of all conflict. Of course, there are conflicts from which you can, arrive to an understanding, and many conflicts are not antagonistic. But there is a specific type of conflict which are antagonistic, and that's what I call antagonistic. No, it is not possible to arrive at a solution. It's not a question of sitting together, and this is of course what I find very problematic about deliberative democracy, the idea that if we can sit together, and take time and discuss, we should necessarily arrive to an agreement. And it's possible in some cases, but there are in fact some conflict that for which I will not work, and we need to recognize that. And what I call a political conflict, properly political conflict, is precisely this conflict that is an antagonistic one. Because, in fact, a political conflict, as I understand it, always requires to make a choice between alternatives that are undecidable from a rational point of view. It is not a question of, so I was just saying, sitting, discussing, and then we will arrive at a rational solution. No, I think that in this case it does not where there are conflicts in which you need to take a stand, and it implies exclusion, negation of another position. What I contend is that political life will never be able to dispense with antagonism, for it concerns public action and the formation of collective identities. In fact, political life consists in constructing a we in a context of diversity and conflict. This is what for me politics is about. We are a we but in a context of conflict. But in order to constitute a we, and that's another of my fundamental thesis, one must distinguish it from a them. There's no way to have us, a we, without having a them. I mean, I don't have time here to develop this point, but it's not just something that I'm asserting. In fact, I've got a whole philosophical grounding for that, which is based on, in part, I mean, it's got to do with the work of Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, who, for instance, in way in which that for him identities are always relational. I mean, he's part, of course, he speaks of languages, but for instance, in the case of in order to have meaning for the term mother, for instance, you need to have something which is not the mother, because the term mother makes sense in a context in which there are father, or there are sister, there is son, and there are. So you see, identities are always relational. There is not, you can't have, and of course it's an essential thesis of what is the anti-essentialist approach. Identities are never there given. They are always constructed in relation. And in the field of, well, of course, for Saussure, this is a main thesis of his linguistic. But, and Derrida has also developed that point in which he insists. I mean, there is an American philosopher called Henry Staten, who has used a term to put together all those ideas of Derrida, difference, trace, and he referred to that as the existence of a constitutive outside. Constitutive outside, I mean, briefly, I mean that in order to have an identity, you need to have something which is an outside, which is the condition of possibility for the construction of that identity. And this is what I apply to politics, and I say in order to have a we need to have an outside, we need to have another, them, and we can't have a we without an outside. I mean, this is something which is very important for me for politics, because if we accept that collective identities always, you know, any type of we requires that you have a they, it means that there is always the possibility that in certain conditions, this we-they relation, which does not need to always be antagonistic, because there are many forms of we-them which are simply a question of difference. You know, we are different, but, well, just to give you an example of that, the idea that there are, to have, for instance, the Catholic only exists because there are people who are not Catholic. We are Protestant, Muslim, and of course that doesn't mean that there is going to be an antagonism between them. But, and we know enough by, you know, current experience, in some condition, this relation, which is constructed in religious terms, can become antagonistic. I mean, one of the big examples of that, of course, is the situation in, well, things are better at the moment, but in Northern Ireland, you had a conflict. They were Catholic and Protestant, but they were in conflict. It was this conflict that became political. You know, so what I want to insist here is that this distinction, which is not necessarily antagonistic, can always, in certain conditions, become antagonistic. In fact, I know that I'm speaking about that. I'm thinking that it might be quite interesting, you know, to see that in terms of what happened in Ukraine. I think you might probably try to see if that makes sense for you, because one of the examples that I give usually to that is the antagonism becoming a relation of difference becoming antagonistic is the dissolution of Yugoslavia, because in Yugoslavia, during the Tito's year, for instance, you had different national identities. I find about the Croat, the Slovene, the Serb, and that was their relation was not an antagonistic one. You know, they were antagonism. Of course, it's when you construct the relation we/they in terms of an enemy. They were not antagonistic, but of course, you know, Tito dies, come Milosevic, and then Milosevic tried to impose Serbian supremacy, and then of course the relation between Slovene and Croat became antagonistic. It became antagonistic to the point that, you know, it led to civil war and to the real war. So it does show you that you can never come to a point that will exclude this possibility. It's an ever-present possibility. this is why I think that it's important to acknowledge this dimension of possibility of antagonism in order to create the institutions that are going to make it less likely that they become a relation of antagonism. And this is, of course, why I have argued in my work that the crucial question for democratic politics is not, as many political theories, particularly of the deliberative approach, say, how are we going to arrive to create a consensus without any form of exclusion? So it's a situation in which we are going to include everybody and agree. I mean, this is, so in a sense, it's to construct a we that does not have a they, and this is precisely which I negate this possibility, and if we accept that, then of course we realize that the aim of democratic politics is not to arrive to this rational consensus, but to create the institution, as I was just saying in a moment, that will impede, or again, I prefer to use the term, make it less likely that when the conflict will emerge, it will take an antagonistic form. And in fact, this is the way in which I've elaborated this conception of democracy is my agonistic model of democracy. And I want to say something about that because it's quite important for my argument. According to this agonistic model that I have developed in several of my writings, to conceive pluralist democracy in a way that does not deny the antagonistic dimension which is present in society, supposes envisaging two modes of manifestation of the antagonistic dimension. Because antagonism cannot be eradicated, but antagonism can be put into scene, if we want to put it like that, in different ways. There is the strictly antagonistic conception, which is basically a relation of friend and enemy. The they is seen as an enemy to be destroyed, and of course this is not compatible with pluralist democracy, or a confrontation which I've called the agonistic confrontation, and that's a confrontation between adversaries. The agonistic confrontation is different from the antagonistic one, not because it allows for a possible consensus, because this is for me, starting point, but because in that case the opponent is not seen as an enemy to be destroyed, but an adversary whose existence is perceived as legitimate. Her ideas will be fought with vigor, but her right to defend those ideas is never going to be questioned. And I think that for me, this is precisely what democracy is about, to have a situation in which we don't treat our opponents as enemies to be destroyed, but as adversaries. That's the antagonistic. This is the agonistic model. This distinction between antagonism, friend and enemy relation, and agonism, relation between adversaries, permit us to understand why, contrary to what many democratic theories believe, it is not necessary to negate the ineradicability of antagonism in order to visualize the establishment of a democratic order. This is, in fact, where I argue against Habermas, because Habermas believed that if we recognize the ineradicability of antagonism, that we necessarily jeopardize the possibility of democracy. And I disagree with that, because I say there is also the possibility of envisaging this antagonism and understanding by that conflict that cannot have a solution on the agonistic mode. In fact, for me, the agonistic confrontation, far from representing a danger for democracy, as it is often presented, is the very condition of existence of democracy. Of course, democracy cannot survive without certain form of consensus. For me, this consensus must consist in the allegiance to what I call the ethico-political values that constitute the principle of legitimacy of democracy, liberty and equality for all, and also the institution in which those principles are going to be inscribed, but it must also enable the agonistic expression of that conflict. That I want to explain you what I mean. We can perfectly agree liberty and equality for all are our the principles that are common to the political association. But of course, when it comes to say, okay, but what is liberty? What is equality? How to conceive it? And the all, who is the all? Then of course there will always be different interpretation. And this is an interpretation that is not a question of sitting together and, okay, let's try to get the real meaning of liberty, the real meaning of equality, and then define who is it. This will necessarily, for me, it's what democracy is about, is the constant discussion about how to interpret those principles. But there must have an agreement on the principle. So what I speak of what I call a conflictual consensus. We need consensus, but we need also the possibility of disagreeing about the meaning and the form of institution. So this is for me central, because this is what's going to give the possibility to the citizen to have really a choice between different alternatives. Then they are going to, well, no, this is this kind of interpretation is the one that I defend, and on other one, but it needs to have the possibility precisely to decide between alternatives. Let's come now to another concept which is central to my approach after the one of antagonism, and it's the concept of hegemony. To adequately apprehend the nature of the political, I think it's necessary to introduce this concept of hegemony. To understand the political as the ever-present possibility of antagonism, as I've just argued, supposes acknowledging the absence of a final ground and the undecidability that pervades every order. So it's not a question of rational consensus, but accepting precisely that there will always be contestation about their meaning. It is precisely this dimension that to which the category of hegemony refers. The dimension of indecidability. So the fact there is not a final ground. This is why our approach is also called post-foundationalist. There is not a final ground that we should try to. No, there is no final ground. And I think that's absolutely important. This is what the hegemony concept indicates. The fact that every society is the product of practices that seek to establish an order, but always in a context of contingency. The social is, in fact, what we call the social is constituted by what we can refer to as sedimented hegemonic practices. And by that I refer to practices that conceal the originary act of their contingent political institution and that try to appear as if they proceed from a natural order. To eliminate, erase the fact that they are always the product of political intervention and say, no, this is how the things are. When you manage to create a common sense, and I'll come back later in the discussion of the common sense, in which people say, no, that is how things are, then you establish your hegemony. In fact, this perspective reveals that every order results from the temporary and precarious articulation of contingent practices. I insist on that. Temporary, precarious, and contingent. So it's always, this is central to the idea of hegemony. This, when I speak that social order is hegemonic in nature, is precisely because, the practice that constitute him are temporary, precarious, and contingent. So we can say that every order is the expression of a particular structure of power relation, and that it is always established through the exclusion of other possibilities. This is why it can be called political. So it means, and that I think it is something extremely important for politics, that they are always alternative, that has been not chosen or eliminated and can be reactivated. For instance, I think that in the struggle against neoliberalism it's absolutely crucial, because you probably have heard that Margaret Thatcher was called Tina because she was claiming there is no alternative. And of course this has become the mantra. In Macron in France, they say, no, there is no alternative. This is the only. There are always alternatives. Neoliberalism is not the end of history. It's not the only possible. It is the product of political intervention. It's a product of hegemonic practices, and we can really other order is possible. Another world is possible. That was the slogan of the anti-globalization movement. So I think this is something that this approach in terms of hegemony is what allows us to understand that there is always the possibility of another order. What is at stake in the agonistic struggle is in fact the very configuration of power relation that structure a social order and the type of hegemony that they construct. It is a confrontation between conflicting hegemonic projects, and of course they can never be reconciled rationally. In fact, the very idea that it's hegemonic means that it is a choice. You've taken, decision, and the decision that always implies that it's ultimately undecidable rationally. In fact, this is the Jacques Derrida refers precisely to the term decision in that sense. He says if it's not based on an ultimate undecidability, then it's not really a decision. Because then if you can algorithmically arrive to this conclusion, then it's not a decision. So a decision implies this. For Derrida, deciding is always deciding in an undecidable terrain. I think that's absolutely crucial to recognize that. And in the case of the agonistic struggle, and I want to insist on that too, the antagonistic dimension is always present. It's not that it disappears, but it is enacted by means of a confrontation whose procedures are accepted by the adversaries. I think that it shows that such an agonistic perspective takes account of the fact that every social order is politically instituted, and that the ground in which hegemonic intervention occurs is never a neutral ground. Again, that's the thing that neoliberalism tried to present. The ground of their decision is neutral. And then of course this is why experts could decide better than the citizen. No, the ground is never neutral. The ground on which we decide is always the product of previous hegemonic practices. And this view that I'm defending here sees the public sphere as the battleground in which hegemonic projects confront one another with no possibility of a final reconciliation. At the end, I'm going to say something about how I see the role of artistic practices according to this perspective. But now I want, after those general considerations, because I think that it's impossible to understand my whole argument if you don't start from the concept of antagonism and the concept of hegemony. I think that now we are more in condition to understand the role of passion in the field of politics. Remember that I'm posing this question within the post-foundationalist ontological framework that I've just outlined, and the I insist on the ever possibility of antagonism, the difference between the political and politics, and in fact we can say that in it's a thesis that society is necessarily divided. Society is divided. That's a thesis, that of course is specific to the dissociative conception of politics, and the people who follow the associative conception of politics will not agree with that. But this is why I think it's important when you begin to speak to say where from you are speaking, because it's going to condition. If you start from a associative conception, we are going to have a completely different reasoning than if you start from a dissociative conception. And another point I want to insist on is that crucial to the framework that I developed is the assertion that what is at stake in politics is the construction of political identities, and that the construction of political identities always entails what Freud called a libidinal investment. I'm going to say in a moment something more about Freud. As I have already indicated at the beginning, by using the term passion, I want to distinguish my reflection from the issue of individual emotion. And I think that you might begin to understand why I make this distinction. More precisely, by passion, I designate a certain type of common affects. The common affects that are mobilized in the political domain, in the formation of the we-they form of identification. So you see that I needed to explain why I understand politics in terms of we-they, because this is what introduced the way in which passion are important, because in order to create a we, it's very important to mobilize common affects. And this is what I call passion. Those common affects which are at stake in the construction of political identities. And you see that the term emotion will not be adequate to refer to that. And clearly my aim here is to challenge the rationalist conception which is dominant in democratic political theory. And I want to underline both the collective and the partisan character of political action, bringing to light the crucial role played by affect in the construction of political identities. One of my key criticisms of liberal democratic theories is their incapacity to acknowledge this affective dimension. Incapacity which I take to be the consequence of their picture of the individual that they present as acting in the field of politics, as moved either by the pursuit of her interest, and that's the model of democracy, which is called the aggregative conception of democracy, or by moral concern, that's basically the deliberative model of democracy. But neither of them is able to recognize this role of passion in the creation of political identities. And this is what precludes them from recognizing the collective nature of political actors and asking one of the key questions for democratic politics: how are the collective form of identification created, and what is the part that affect play in that process? This is in fact what my reflection on passion aims at addressing. Of course, I'm perfectly aware, because this kind of objection, as many people have made to me, that passion is usually a negative connotation, being perceived by many liberal individualists as referring to affects of irrational or undesirable nature. But this is precisely the view that I want to challenge. To begin with, this study of passion, which is, I'm trying in a sense to put back in the reflection in political theory, was at the center of the reflection of 17th century philosophers like Hobbes, Descartes, Spinoza, and Pascal. And it's only later, and that's, I think it's interesting to see when it disappeared, when it was displaced by Enlightenment rationalism, that the term passion acquired a negative connotation. No, that's irrational. This is not what politics, democratic politics should be about. And in fact, we had to wait for Freud and the development of psychoanalysis to revive and reformulate the themes that had been explored by those early modern theories of the passion. Among those theories, I think that Spinoza is particularly relevant for our current discussion, and it's interesting to see that the affinities between Spinoza's notion of the conatus, not to persevere in our movement, in our identity, and Freud libido. It is often been pointed out that there is really some affinities between Spinoza conatus and Freud libido, emphasizing the role of passion is no doubt open to the objection that those passions can be mobilized in ways which will undermine the democratic institution. And I think this is clearly the fear that leads many theorists to exclude them from democratic politics. But as I have argued, this is a very perilous point of view, because refusing to provide democratic channels for the expression of collective affect, of passion, lays the terrain for antagonistic form of their mobilization. And this is why I think it is therefore vital for an agonistic politics whose objective is the construction of a we-they in an agonistic way in terms of adversaries and not enemies, to envisage the condition under which adversarial common affect can be brought about, because, and this is, for instance, something that I develop in my work about populism, the fact that by saying, no, mobilizing passion as something that, democratic politics doesn't do, well, you leave the terrain open for right-wing populism to mobilize those passions. Once affects are recognized as playing a central role in the construction of collective identities, the following question arises. How can affect be mobilized in a counter-hegemonic direction? By counter-hegemonic, what I mean is precisely the discourse which is going to be opposed to try to undermine, to question the existing hegemony. Counter-hegemonic, to construction of another hegemony, disarticulation and rearticulation of the hegemony. I think that to examine this question, psychoanalysis provides important insight that can be made fruitful politically through their articulation with the discursive hegemonic perspective that I have just presented. Freud, for instance, brought to the fore the crucial role played by affective libidinal bonds in processes of collective identification. As he stated in his book, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, and here I quote Freud, a group is clearly held together by a power of some kind. And to what power could this feat be better ascribed than to Eros, which holds together everything in the world? End of quote. Since affects are conceived by Freud as being malleable and susceptible of being oriented in different directions, then we can understand that the task for radical democratic politics is to foster affective libidinal attachment that will contribute to the formation of a counter-hegemonic movement. How can that be realized? Well, it's a very big, difficult question, and I certainly don't intend to answer it here. And in any case, you can't answer that at a theoretical level. It's always in specific conjuncture, specific condition that you can pose this question. But I think we can, have some ideas about how that could better be done. And here is where I want to suggest that some insight from Spinoza conception of the affect are particularly useful, namely the distinction that Spinoza makes between what he calls affectio and affectus, that is, affection and affect. Affection is a state in which you are, and affect is affectus is the affect that can be produced by that state. Like Freud, Spinoza believe that it is desire that moves human beings to act, and he notes that what makes them act in one direction rather than in another are the affects. An affection for Spinoza is, as I was saying, a state of a body insofar as it is subject to the action of another body. When affected by something exterior, the conatus, and here I remind you that the conatus is the general striving to persevere in our being, then this conatus will experience affect when we are in a certain situation of affection, in Spinoza's term, then the conatus will experience affect that will make it move in a direction and desire something and then act accordingly. So you've got here three steps: the affection, the state, the condition, the practice, and you have produce some affects. The affects produce desire, and the desire is what moves you to act. I find this dynamic of affectio affectus really helpful to envisage the process of production of common affects. And I propose to employ this dynamic to examine the mode of transformation of political identities, seeing affection as the space where the discursive and the affective are articulated in specific practices. So we need to, and I hope that you will understand better when I develop my point about artistic practices. What we need is to create condition, affection that are going to produce affects, and of course those affection, and this is what I want to insist here, is they are both discursive, affective. It's something that is not pure mobilization of emotion, because there must also be some kind of discursive element, but it can't be exclusively discursive. There is a debate at the moment about, particularly the affective turn is basically saying, no, let's forget about the discursive, let's forget about hegemony. They in fact speak of the post-hegemony. And of course the neuroscience are important in that approach. What move you to us are not ideas. It's just something that purely affect on your body. So it's not the discourse. It just creates the situation which are going to affect your brain in a special direction. So this is so for them is everything which is got to the element of the discursive. It must be eliminated. On the other side, of course, and this is what I was criticizing, the mainstream political theory, is they reject the question of affect. They say, no, it's all discursive. We need to produce arguments. We need to produce reasoning. This is what makes people move. And what I'm arguing here is that you need to articulate. It's neither pure emotion or affect of on your or the discourse. You need to find discursive affective practices in which people are going to be affected, both at the level of the discursive and the affected. Here, of course, I probably need to stress, because I've just introduced the term discursive, and it has led to many misunderstandings. By discursive, I'm not referring to a practice concerned exclusively with speech or writing. This, of course, I know this is usually the term discourse, but in fact I'm using the term discourse in the way in which Michel Foucault used discourse. And in fact I'm referring to signifying practices. in which signification and action cannot be separated. It's also, for instance, but when Wittgenstein speaks of language games, it's something similar. In fact, when what we refer to the discursive is what Wittgenstein called language game. That again should not be understood only in terms of language. You know, it's of course very practice. There is a material aspect, and there is an aspect of, you know, real action. It's not pure discursive in the sense of linguistic. So for me, discursive refer to signifying practices in which signification and action cannot be separated. It is through their insertion in discursive signifying practices that social agents acquire form of subjectivity. We should see those discursive inscriptions as providing the affection which will bring about the affects which will spur desire and lead to specific action. So in fact here what's at stake is combining the recognition that affects and desire play a crucial role in the constitution of subjectivity with the assertion that they are also the moving force of political action. So it's, you know, the two levels are important. So now I want to finish by saying something about how I see the role of artistic practices in all this reflection. But before examining this question, I want to remind you of something which I have repeatedly emphasized in my work, is that one should not see the relation between art and politics as two separate fields. That is, having on one side there is art, on the other side there are politics, and then you need to establish a relation between the two. According to my approach, there is a political dimension in art, and there is an aesthetic dimension in politics. And this is why, for instance, I've argued that we should not distinguish between political art, because an art will be supposedly, you know, free from politics. Because I don't like to use the term political art, because it, in a sense, implies that there are art which is not political, and this is precisely what I want to put into question, because I think there is necessarily a political dimension in all form of art. And this is why I have in fact suggested to speak rather of critical art. So when we instead of speaking of political art, let's speak of critical art, because of course that implies there is art which is not critical, but that does not mean that it is not political. It might be an art that reproduces the actual hegemony, you know, but it has got a political dimension. For the hegemonic perspective that I'm defending, artistic practices play a role in the constitution and the reproduction of a symbolic order, or in its challenging, necessarily. You know, either it reproduces the hegemonic order or it challenges it. And this is why it necessarily have a political dimension. Politics, for its part, concern the symbolic ordering of social relation, what the French philosopher Claude Lefort called the mise en scène, the mise en forme, to put into scene, to put into form of human coexistence. And this is why, in fact, necessarily politics has got an aesthetic dimension. No, insisting, so it's not two different, completely different things that need to be put into relation, but you know, there is some kind of political dimension, you know, in all form of art. Well, in several of my works, I've examined the relevance of the hegemonic approach for the sphere of artistic practices. Such an approach reveals that artistic practices constitute an important terrain for the construction of political identities, and that they contribute to the emergence of new forms of subjectivity. By bringing to the fore the discursive nature of the social, no, by that I mean the fact that social is not just there, it's always constructed through signifying practices. It reveals that what we take to be our world is always the result of a given hegemony. You know, this is again is one of the main theses of the anti-essentialist approach. You don't have a world there that is no. The world is always constructed through what we call discourse, understanding by that signifying practices, and this is why it's always the result of an hegemony. This means that what we see as the natural world is in fact always constructed through a variety of hegemonic practices. Those practices are not only located in the traditional political institution. Of course, there are many of the practices that construct an hegemony are of many different nature, and not only of a traditional political understanding, but they are also located in the multiplicity of spaces in what is sometimes called civil society. Here I'm inspired very much by the approach of Antonio Gramsci, who has very much insisted that what he called civil society is where a particular conception of the world is established. And that's particular conception of the world is what he called the common sense. So the common sense is never something completely neutral. So it's always politically, hegemonically constructed. And basically this is done at the level of what he called civil society. And Gramsci insisted on the centrality played by artistic and cultural practices in the formation and the diffusion of this common sense. Gramsci's approach allows us to grasp the decisive role that artistic practices could play in the hegemonic struggle. What is at stake in this struggle is indeed the transformation of the common sense understood as the space where specific forms of subjectivities are constructed. You know, so this is the common sense is a result of a struggle between different constructions. It takes place in agonistic public spheres, and cultural and artistic practices play a very important role in this construction of the common sense, in its reproduction and in its transformation. What I want to insist here is that one could develop those reflections about the role of artistic practices in the construction of the common sense, Gramsci's conception, by articulating them with the question of the affect that I have just discussed. As we have seen for Spinoza, it is through the medium of the affections that human beings can experience affects that are going to make them decide something and act accordingly. And I have proposed to see those affections as the spaces where the discursive and the affective are articulated in specific practices. And here I insist that those practices can be of a different nature. And I want to see here insist on the role of artistic practices as part of those affection, to use the term of Spinoza. After having acknowledged in the first moment the role of artistic practices in the construction of the common sense, I think what we can show in a second moment is the role that they play in a constitution of different form of subjectivity, revealing that it is thanks to the affective force of those practices that the subjective dimension can be activated. Now, this I think is really something that one can insist on the fact that in order for those practices to really have an effect, to transform subjectivity, they need it to acquire an affective force. And here I want to insist that for all those who want to intervene in the cultural and artistic domain in a counter-hegemonic way, I mean, to use of course, not necessarily, it's not prescriptive. There are certainly artists who aim is not to try to construct a counter-hegemonic discourse, but those who want to do it, I think it is very important for them to visualize artistic practices as an articulation of discursive and affective element. You know, so to imagine the impact of your practice both in the discursive and affective dimension. Contrary to the rationalist approach, such a perspective that I defend indicates that is not by reaching the understanding through concept that artistic practices are able to bring about a transformation of subjectivity. It is by their articulation with affects that those ideas can gain real force and crystallize in desire. This is a point which, you know, I know is contested, because I think that there is a tendency, particularly around conceptual art, to say no, you know, important is really to reach the understanding to concept, and this is what that, you know, in fact there is a tendency for certain theorists to believe that it's possible. And this should be, in a sense, you know, privileged by artistic practices to produce concept. Well, here I'm not a Deleuzian, but I think there is a point in which I do agree with Deleuze, and it's in the book that he wrote with What is Philosophy, he criticized this view, and he said that you know, the aim of art is not to produce concept. And I totally agree with him on that. For him, it's philosophy that produces concept, but art should not kind of producing concept, because I think it's by articulation with affects. Of course, there are ideas in art, but it's with articulation with affects that they can gain force and crystallize in desire. This means that the impact of artistic practices should not be envisaged primarily at the cognitive level, and this is the tendency against which I'm arguing. The object of artistic practices, as I just said, is not the production of concepts, but the production of sensation. That's also what Deleuze says. And the cognitive, conceptual dimension should not be privileged. This does not mean, of course, that there is no cognitive dimension in artistic practices. I'm not saying at all that there is no cognitive dimension in artistic practices, but that is via the affective dimension that this cognitive dimension should be reached. You know, so it's really the aim of is produce sensation. It's of course the sensation affects are going to have a discursive element, but the aim is not to produce concept, because then you can perfectly not take in account of the importance of sensation and the role of the affect. And this is why and that's my thesis, if we want to visualize how artistic practices can contribute to the subversion of the dominant hegemony, it is fruitful to acknowledge their discursive affective character, conceiving them as providing affection able to modify subjective structure. So I think the artistic practices and the cultural practices of very different nature, really, I think that we can, conceive of them as affection in the sense of Spinoza situation, to contribute to put people in some situation, to affect them in a way in which this is going to produce desire and to move them to act, to create. I think this is why I think it's so important to recognize this dimension, and the fact that, and here definitely I agree with Gramsci, those practices, cultural and artistic, have got a very important role to play in the construction and the transformation of the common sense. So I want to finish saying that for those who want to contribute to a radical politics of counter-hegemonic engagement with neoliberal institutions, if this is your aim to create a new hegemony, it is important to cultivate a multiplicity of practices that will erode the common affect sustaining the current neoliberal hegemony. Because neoliberal hegemony is sustained by a certain type of common affects. And, if we want to fight against it, we need to produce other common affects. Those practices there should aim at fostering affects of a different nature. A counter-hegemonic politics necessitates, therefore, the creation of a different regime of desire and affect, so as to bring about a collective will which is sustained by common affect that are able to challenge the existing order. And this is exactly what I understand by the mobilization of passion. And this is what I take this to be so crucial for politics, to create new form of subjectivity, to bring about different regime of desire and affect, because this is only on that condition that one can develop a progressive politics. It's not just by making speech and giving argument. You really need to act at the affective level, because this is going to produce new form of subjectivities. Unfortunately, I think left parties do not understand the importance of mobilizing passion into a democratic direction. I'm speaking here, of course, for Western Europe, but this is something which I think can also be valid for other places. Those left parties believe that it is something, this mobilization of passion, that is specific to the right, and that left politics should limit itself to rational argument and to deliberative procedure. This is why I think they are not able to answer the challenge posed by the rise of right-wing populist movement, whose success is linked to the fact that they do understand much better than the left that politics is always partisan, and that it requires the creation of a us-them relation. They are, here I'm speaking of right-wing populist parties, aware of the importance of constructing collective political identities and of fostering the development of a collective will. The people, we are going to speak in the name of the people. And this is what explains their growing success in many European countries, where they have managed to foster new form of collective identification about a notion of the people constructed in a way that in fact curtails democracy instead of radicalizing it. This for me is really what explains the success of right-wing populist movement. And I think definitively the best way to fight against those parties is not by accusing them of populism, condemning their appeal to affect, and claiming that democratic politics must be exclusively based on rational argument, and that it is necessary to expel passion from politics. I am convinced that such a stance is in fact the main obstacle to the elaboration of a strategy to challenge what is our post-democratic condition. What is at stake is the construction of a progressive collective will, able to crystallize affects, aiming at the deepening of democracy. Because Spinoza was keen to stress, and I think this is a reflection which is very important and that we should really meditate, he said, an affect can only be displaced by an opposed affect that is stronger than the one to be repressed. So, it's not through pure arguments that you are going to win. You need to create affects which are stronger than the ones which are mobilized by right-wing populism. Thanks for your attention.
So referring to your last book, which is now upcoming in the Verso publishing house next month, for the left populism. We discussed this question a bit before. Yeah, so we and basically the problem is apart from having this wave of right-wing populists across Europe and basically on a global scale. At the same time, and you a bit like in a provocative manner entitled your book for the left populism. So we need a kind of an alternative populism in the current political status quo. But at the same time, будь ласка, можна тихіше, спасибі. And at the same time, I would like to point at the problem which has very urgent importance also here in Ukraine, but also in a broader sense in the Eastern Europe as such, as we discussed also yesterday. And I think it's very important to elaborate on that also publicly. Why do you think it is so important to differentiate between right-wing populism and neo-Nazis? Right? What is the difference, and what is the potential? Because if you are referring to some kind of political potential, effective or passionate political potential behind the populism, so it can be somehow politically redirected. So what is the difference, and how one can differentiate in each case the strategies that right-wing populists are following and those of the extreme right, neo-Nazis or Nazis probably, like in Ukraine? Thank you.
Well,
does this work? Це працює?
Yeah? Okay. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, it works.
It works? Okay.
Yeah, but maybe you can use this is better one. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's difficult to answer that shortly, you know, and I don't want. I could go for another hour explaining that. Well, it's not so much. How can I say that easily? Well. One of the claim I made, I mean, the book, but I've made it already in many places, and through my book, because in fact I've been since my interest in understanding the reason for the rise of right-wing populism comes from long time, you know, because I've been beginning to think about that on the basis of the rise of the FPÖ of Georg Haider and in Austria. So in fact, from the beginning of 2000, I've been trying to understand why, you know, but more recently, and what we've seen, and in fact, obviously, I'm particularly interested because I follow very much the situation in France. The way in which, for instance, the French left in general have tried to oppose Marine Le Pen. You know, for instance, they do not accept that there has been that there is a basic difference between the Front National of Jean-Marie Le Pen and then Marine Le Pen. There is really a difference between the two. They say, oh, Marine Le Pen is just, you know, the same thing. No, it's not true at all, because Marie Le Pen was very much more. It was basically extreme right movement. Coming from it was never any. Can you stop making this photograph, because this really disturbed me. I was already bothered by that there, but I didn't want to interrupt. But no, please don't do it anymore. Come on. I think that another criticism I'm making is very. Well, for me, one of my argument is that because what is really new about the success of Marine Le Pen is the fact that she now is extended audience, and that many people from the popular classes, from the workers, are attracted to the discourse. They are voting for Le Front National. And Le Front National is also, for instance, the discourse of Marine Le Pen. Honestly, there are parts in which it was more on the left than the one of François Hollande. You know, because she was defending the welfare state, she was defending the state, and she could do that because the social democrats, I mean the socialist party, had abandoned the working class. So she was able to recover a sense of demand of those and present them as you know, what the Front National would do, and of course it means. And that's one of my main arguments, that the success, and I think that's not only true for France, it's true for many other European countries. I don't know if it's at all, no, I don't think it's the case, it's similar in here, but is that social democrats have completely they've become social liberal, they've accepted neoliberalism. They don't have any discourse for the what are called the loser of neoliberal globalization. They've really abandoned those. In fact, there was in France a few years ago, not that long ago, a think tank called Terra Nova, which was a think tank, you know, the Socialist Party, who declared, they say, the working class are lost for us. You know, we are never going to be able to recover them. They vote for Marine Le Pen. So what we should attract are, he said, the immigrants, because the immigrants are less likely to vote for Marine Le Pen because of her discourse. You know, so they offer to Marine Le Pen the working classes. And so they are the ones who are responsible. My claim is that it is the politics of the socialists or the social democrats, which is of the abandonment of the working class, which is the origin of the success of right-wing populism. But of course, they will never recognize it. So for them, it's very much easier to oppose Marine Le Pen on kind of moralistic ground. There's, this is a neo-Nazi party. She's not Republican. She's because. In fact, then they can present that as some kind of moral disease, you know, it's a return of the Bronze Plague. So there is in society some kind of, you know, it's like a moral disease for them. This. And it happens, you know, sometimes it comes back, and then the only way is we can try to do is what's called the cordon sanitaire, you know, to impede thinking that by doing that, they are going to impede, by declaring that those parties are Nazi or neo-Nazi, then they think that they are going to stop their success. Because they are not able to really even try to make an analysis of the success of those parties. And this is why I think that, for me, those parties represent something new. Something new which cannot be understood under traditional terms, and something new which is come precisely of the fact that those parties are in fact the one who claim to represent the interests of the working class. The phenomenon of Trump, the success of Trump is absolutely linked to that. You know, he managed because but there is a very interesting book by Thomas Frank, who is, I don't know if you know him here, but he's written several books, which I think he's a journalist, and it's very interesting because he has shown, but already before the victory of Trump, in fact, before the victory of Trump, he wrote a book called Listen Liberal, where he, in fact, criticized the evolution of the Democratic Party and showed how, since Clinton, the two presidencies of Clinton, the Democrats have completely abandoned the working class, and they centering themselves on kind of identity issue, and he is already saying those classes they don't feel that the Democratic Party represents them anymore. And they are likely to be attracted by a demagogue who tell them that, oh, well, we are going to represent you. Well, the same thing exactly happens in Western Europe. Many parties of socialists cannot really understand this phenomenon because they do not realize that they are the responsible, or they do not realize, they don't want to accept that they are the responsible for that. So I think that first we need to understand that there is a new phenomenon, which I call right-wing populism, which is really specific to the conjuncture that exists today in the fact that the abandonment by socialist parties of the working class. And by that I don't like the discussion, there are treason. No, and I think there are clear reasons to understand why that has happened. The reason is that since those parties, Social Democrats, have capitulated to neoliberalism, they accept the idea that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. It's evident that they cannot have a discourse for the loser of neoliberal globalization. Because there is no alternative. They basically represent the interests of the middle class and the people who are the winner of neoliberal globalization. And this is what has created the possibility for this counter-discourse. So this is why, basically, why I think that what I want to insist here, and again, I probably will need much more time to explain that clearly, but basically, I attacking the amalgam which is made between right-wing populism and neo-Nazi, because I say that does not allow us to understand the reason for the rise of those parties, and in fact, it's just a strategy by the Social Democrats to demonize. They also believe by demonizing those parties, they are going to it's complex, because there is also it is linked obviously to their incapacity to understand the role of affect, but basically to the idea that for them, well, since there is really no alternative, they have abandoned the idea that politics is necessarily partisan. So they have too much. We can basically what has happened in Western Europe is that in this famous consensus of the center, there is no fundamental difference between the politics offered by the center right and the center left. So there is no alternative. And the only one who say, no, there is an alternative. We are going to ask, usually for a long time, they were only the parties of right-wing populism. So this is basically the reason for which I think that it is really completely inadequate to assimilate them. I'm not saying by that there are no, of course there are extreme right-wing parties, but they are very marginal and I don't think that it helps to fight against them by assimilating them to right-wing populism. I mean, I stop here because I could say much more, but I don't want to monopolize to have the distinction. But basically, I think that it does not help us to understand the specificity of those movements, and it's an excuse by the socialist parties to simply not accept their responsibility in the development of those parties.
Thank you. Yeah, there is a question here.
Good evening. My name is Anna Kurishva. For more than 20 years now, I work for the foundation which tries to encourage social changes in Ukraine by means of arts and education. And now we developed quite wide network with Ukrainian universities and regions. And now we work on the development of our international contacts with universities who have an expertise in using
but
arts.
Sorry, please, to the question. Okay.
Using arts as a tool to transform the society? Maybe you can suggest us such kind of universities who really have long-term expertise in this field. Thank you.
No, honestly, I mean, I don't. I will have to think and make some research about that, but just like that, I could not. So, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah, another question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. I have two very closely connected questions. The first, they are about democracy and antagonism. So you have said that democratic institutions should prevent differences from turning into antagonism. But what if antagonism already occurred? So what is the role of democratic institutions then? As far, maybe I get you wrong, but from the rest of your lecture, I might suggest that the role of democratic institutions is to canalize a fact in a way this antagonism will turn into difference again, or through suggesting some more the stronger effect. And the second question is, in what way it should be done technically? So how can we do this effect management? How it is evoked? Thank you.
Okay, well, no, I did not use the term. I'm not saying that the question is to turn antagonism into difference, because precisely difference, well, it depends. Difference is not difference in itself is not antagonistic, because I insist very much. I say, for me, an antagonism is a very specific type of conflict. A conflict that does not have a rational solution. So difference is not a conflict, you know. What I use the term difference in another context when I say not necessarily every form of construction as them is antagonistic, because they are simply different. You know, for instance, I gave the example of religion, but we could also take different of nations. For instance, there will not, in order to have Germans, you know, you need to have people who are not German, who are Ukrainian, or they are, or you can't think. It is basically, and that's what I was referring to, the linguistic of Saussure. The question is to see that identities are necessarily relational. Okay? So this is a point. In order to have, we the Catholic, we need to have that they are the Protestant or Buddhist. In order to have national identities, you need to have different national identities. But doesn't mean that necessarily between French and German, or between Ukrainian and Russian, there must be an antagonism. It can be there are situations in which simply the people are different. I was giving the example of Yugoslavia, for instance. There was of course a difference between the Slovene, the Croat, but there was no antagonism. But in certain conditions, what is a distinction which is simply understood in terms of a difference can turn to be an antagonistic one, and then it becomes political. But it doesn't mean that I realize why you might have understood what I was saying. So, but I'm not saying that we've got to turn that back into a difference, because in terms of a political conflict, I realized the exactly what you were getting at, and I see. But of course, ideally, obviously, one should have the institutional. Let me put it in another way, because what I'm saying is that this political antagonism that can emerge out of many differences. You know, they are, but in that case, you have to distinguish between things which are pure, which could be put back, taken out of the political dimension. So, for instance, there are situations in which basically what had become political should be going back to being a simple difference. In that case, we are not anymore in the terrain of politics, but there are cases in which antagonism there are some conflict in which really you've got to find ways in which, without eliminating them or eliminating, I don't like them, making them, eliminating them from the terrain of the political, you need to face the fact that they are some form of conflict which will not disappear, but can really be turned into an agonistic. So, to turn something from antagonism to agonism does not mean to reverse to what is simply a question of difference. In some cases, it should be the strategy. But in some other cases, there is a real conflict that is not going to be simply eliminated by saying, no, this is simply a difference. You can, no, there are conflict. And then the question, there are two problems that one can raise here, because one question is that, and that's the most tricky question, once you've got a conflict that has taken an antagonistic form, already taken an antagonistic form, how can you transform it into an agonistic one? There are a few examples of that. For instance, I think that the case of Northern Ireland, to which I had referred in my talk and just now, is a good example of the transformation of an antagonism into an agonism. But because, thanks to the agreement that were made, no, it doesn't mean that the conflict between the Protestant and the Catholic is disappear, because it is really there a question which is it's got very important political implication. What has been reached is that they don't treat themselves as an enemies to be destroyed. They've accepted some procedure, and this, for instance, the IRA enter into the parliament. I mean, in a sense, it's also, for instance, another example of that is the conflict in Colombia between the FARC and the government. I mean, they made it doesn't mean that the FARC have completely accepted the situation of the dominant hegemony. They just stop treating the government as an enemy to be destroyed. They've accepted to play the democratic game. For instance, there are going to be election, and the FARC has entered the political game as a party. That's the transformation of an antagonism into an agonism. Before they were killing each other, they have accepted to have this. It's not that they've agreed, but there is still a conflict, but it's being played out in another register. And this is also what happened in Northern Ireland, because they've entered parliament and they are still fighting for the right, but through the democratic means. And in a sense, for instance, this is so. It means that it is possible, once the conflict has been taken an antagonistic form, to transform it into an agonistic one. It's not easy, but it's possible. But precisely my point is that since it's not easy, the best strategy is to create the institution that will allow, when the conflict emerges, that is not going to take an antagonistic form, but an agonistic form. And that means to have a real pluralistic system in which voice is given to the people who are dissenting. Because if you have a non-democratic or very authoritarian system in which there is no possibility allowed for opponents to be part of the democratic game, then of course it's more likely that they are going to fight in an antagonistic way, but meaning by that, you know, well, terrorism or well, yeah, no, I don't like this term terrorism very much, but let's say by violent means. So this is my point. You know, there are some political theories that believe that really the aim of democracy is to find a way in which we can all agree on, you know, what is the common good. And this is, and of course then you've got different procedure, rules of some procedure and other matter, but the aim is that, okay, let's find a way in which we are all going to agree. I think this is not possible because there will always be antagonism, and so it's absurd to spend all that time. What we should use our energies is to create the institution that are going to make it less likely, because of course you can never completely guarantee that antagonism are not going to emerge into this violent form. But if there are democratic institutions, if there is a system that allows people who are in disagreement to express their view in a legitimate way, then it's less likely that they are going to use it in a violent way. You see? So this is what I think it should be the aim of democracy.
Yeah, thank you. Another one, yeah, please.
Thank you. My question refers to that part of your statement when you talk about art, and you suggest that art could be the mobilizer of effect and collective desire. Is there any difference, in your opinion, between art and propaganda? What that is? And to make this question not merely theoretical, I'm thinking of cultural policies, and I don't know the situation in France very specifically, but we are now in the House of Cinema, and Ukrainian State Film Agency recently passed a law on patriotic films, and basically the film that's going to happen is very likely to be patriotic, which can mean somewhat right-wing, and the other type of cinema might disappear. So maybe you can elaborate on that.
Okay, well, propaganda, you know, but I think that in this case we are more looking for what I would call artistic criteria, because it's a complicated question again, because, yeah, in fact, propaganda can be made in a very artistic way. Think of the film of René Riefenstahl, for instance. It's pure propaganda, but it's also art, you know. It's really complicated. One cannot deny its quality, its artistic quality. On the other side, what I will... all the questions that have been put here are really interesting and challenging. You're really making me think. I like that. So let's try to I think that well, it depends on. I don't like this term propaganda, because clearly I can see the way in which some people will criticize an art, a film. Let's take a film, for instance, which is really developing a political message. You know, so you can and people who are opposed to that can perfectly dismiss that and say, oh, but this is propaganda. Yeah? Okay. And yeah, but I really think that in this, for me there is, if you understand by propaganda, that's the question. What do we understand by propaganda? Because if propaganda is pure something that does not have any artistic, is pure. Oh, I don't know what term I could use in this, but what would be a term? What? Yeah. Yeah, but if it's pure propaganda, it does. If it's pure propaganda, it does not have that. It would. I think, or advertising. Let's say, no. Okay. In that case, I think it works better if we say advertising, because. But you see, again, it's a very tricky issue, because I think more and more today, the way politics is developing, there is really the question of communication. Right? That's something I'm particularly interested in, and I've seen that. In fact, no, well, the case of Macron, for instance, is incredible. The way all those politicians, they've got a team of communicators. Usually people who've been working in advertising campaign before, and then there is politics has become very much something that is ruled by communication things which are basically advertiser. I mean, there is, for instance, you probably know him, but there is some kind of genius of this in Latin America, which is an Ecuadorian called Duran Barba. And Duran Barba is the one, he is such a genius that he has made, for instance, the victory of Macri in Argentina is because he directed. In Britain we call that spin doctors. The spin doctor, the one who advise on politics on communication. Okay, from that point of view, politics is a very important element of propaganda, and unfortunately, I would say one. A left-wing movement that will say, we don't want to have anything to do with that, that would be terrible, because one needs to appropriate that dimension. But of course, this is why I would want to distinguish that from the field of artistic practices, because I think that it's not easy always, but one really it's not too difficult to distinguish between a work which is pure propaganda and something which is got artistic qualities. Okay, but what I would not want to accept is that one needs to distinguish completely that if you if you want to be considered as being an artistic thing, then you cannot have at all any political message, because then people say, but that's not art, that is propaganda. Because this is a way in which I see it can offer film, for instance, which have got a political message, can be easily dismissed as being propaganda. So I think that it's important. It's important to recognize, I will say on one side, that in artistic things there is, I would not say necessarily, but it's very possible to have this element of message. And on the other side, and I was saying with concerning Leni Riefenstahl, I think one must also recognize that in what is seen as mainly when we can call it propaganda or message, can also be done in a way which has got artistic qualities, So I think it's not easy to just say, that's art, that's not art, that's propaganda. Things are more complicated. But we need, basically, what I want to say here is that if you understand because some people will say, everything that touches on affect is propaganda. Okay, that's I think probably what I want to say more, and that is what I want to criticize, because this is part of the rationalist view that we do not need if you are on the left, you only need to use arguments, not to try to mobilize affect, because if you do that, that is pure propaganda. You see, no, I think that it's important to recognize that in the any kind of artistic practices, there is necessarily something that speaks to the affect. You know, so I would not want to purify the thing and say this.
Yeah, please.
And my question is also about art. So in the situation when left parties do not provide any kind of this collective affect, but when we are speaking about critical art, more often it's the left critical art. But is it really able to create a collective affect? Or which type of sensation you were talking about when you said that this is a real aim of art?
I'm not sure. Can you rephrase it, because I'm not sure.
Yes. My question is that you said that, and we know that left political parties do not provide any collective effects, do not work with this, but the art works with this and can provide some collective effect. But I mean, how, if it's not a propaganda? Continue the previous question. How does it work?
No, but I really don't understand the question, because one thing is let's not mix the because there are different arguments I've been making. And I've been making the argument. My main argument is that affects are crucial in the formation of collective identities. Okay. And that this is something that the rationalist approach, which is dominant in most of the left, does not recognize. Okay, so that's one point. And what the other argument is that in order to well, there are two elements here. It's what I was saying. An important element of politics is, in fact, the type of collective identity that you create, and also the way in which the common sense, because I think that the dimension of the common sense is very important in politics, because counter-hegemonic politics necessarily imply transforming the common sense, transforming the way this is how things are and nothing is possible. We need to inject the possibility precisely that other things are possible, okay? But that can be done by many different ways, because there are many different practices that. And what I was saying is that among those practices, which are the ones who construct the common sense, I think that the cultural artistic practices have got a special role, and they are particularly important, because this is where collective, not before collective, because this is something that subjectivities are molded in many ways by cultural practices. I think that, for instance, the way the person we are, the way we see things, is very much influenced by the film we see, the series, or the book we read, the kind of music all those artistic practices play an important role in the constitution of subjectivities. Okay, so this is why I think that if we l'objective is to transform the common sense, we must acknowledge that the role that is attributed, artists have got a role important. I'm not saying here, because I don't want to get too prescriptive, that artists must do. I'm saying if you are an artist, okay, and you are also wanted through your art to contribute to a political project, to a transformation, then I mean what you need to understand is that to have an impact, that your practice have an impact, you must try to find ways to reach people in their affects. And that, for instance, I am very much critical in many. I mean, I've written about that quite a lot, and criticizing, for instance, certain forms. And I've been arguing with people about that among the left. For instance, there are some people that say that critical art or political art necessarily is transgressive, because the more political, the more transgressive. That this is, and it's only if it's very transgressive that it can be political. I disagree with that, because I think that in fact the neoliberalism thrive on transgression. They adore transgression, or it's automatically recuperated. So you want to make their artists would believe that they are going to be extremely radical by doing things which are terribly transgressive. In fact, it's completely on the mark, because this automatically is recuperated by neoliberalism. Another thing which I also don't find very useful is commemorative art, because I think that commemorative art is in fact, well, it's not agonistic enough, because for me, art which is going to need to be agonistic, it needs to suscitate question in you, to make. In order to make you feel things differently, it means that it's going to suscitate question. Commemorative art does not suscitate question at all, just tell you, oh, look how horrible that was, or oh, fantastic. Of course, I know that you cannot do without that, because it's part of politics. But if you are an artist that wants to really, contribute, you should not give importance to this kind of art. For instance, I want to give you an example of that, because it's a Polish artist, Krzysztof Wodiszko. I don't know if some people know him. And Krzysztof is a very good friend of mine, and is very much in line with me about the question of agonism. And he an example of what he did, for instance, he was asked to, I don't remember exactly, but it was Hiroshima. That was done 5, 6 years, maybe a bit here. It was a celebration of an anniversary of Hiroshima. And Krzysztof was asked to provide, some kind of installation for commemorating Hiroshima. And he was thinking, okay, how can I do that in an he's also critical of commemorative art, as I am, but he thought, well, how can I do that in an agonistic way? And he did something, there is a video of it, which I think is really fantastic, because there is one edifice still remaining from before the bomb, yeah. In Hiroshima on one side of the river. And what he did was, it's also very, very, very beautiful. Because that's another thing which I want to say. There are some people on the left who believe that beautiful art is necessarily bourgeois. Beauty is a category that should be absolutely eliminated from art, because that's bourgeois. So in fact, the uglier it is, the thing I think that's completely absurd, because beauty can be very subversive also, So it is, but I can't at the same time take that. No, but I need to show my hand to tell you what Krzysztof did. So the video is, you see, is say it's of ants.
Maybe like this.
Yeah, okay. And it's extremely beautiful. You only see the ants, you don't see the people, and it's projected in front of this house of that remain, and it's ants were, and then a voice in which they questioning the different people who were killed during the Hiroshima, because apparently there were also many Korean women, and in fact the people who were killed at Hiroshima, whenever their specificity, their identity, were never recognized. It was seen as the only, in fact, Japanese destruction, and he did, in fact, a lot of research and realized that he wanted just to bring to the fore, to problematize, in a sense, to say, okay, it's a commemoration, but you must also recognize that among the people who were killed at Hiroshima, they were really a series of people whose specificity was never recognized. So you see the arms, and then there is a dialogue among, indicating, the people speaking and saying who they were, and for instance, they were women, so it is in a sense to commemorate, but commemorate in a way that make you ask questions. You understand? To problematize the thing, to bring to the fore the kind of, because there could be some commemoration that just impose a message on you. No, this is a commemoration, but that suscitate question, that makes you realize that, in fact, there is a complexity that has been erased because that. I think that's a way in which you can have an agonistic form of art. Another, in my book Agonistic, in the chapter on artistic practices, I also, for instance, refer to work of Alfredo Jarre, which is a Chilean artist, which I find also extremely interesting, because he also, let's say, Alfredo Jarre is somebody who said, I don't want to, my artistic intervention are basically to suscitate question in people. I don't want to tell them what they should see, what they should say. I want to bring them to touch them in a way in which they are going to problematize their conception, and I think that this is, for me, what's important. This is what I call an agonistic form of art, not giving a message, and of course, then you need to not all form of artistic practices are as the same potential to creating collective form. For instance, I'm particularly interested in theater, because precisely I think that there is a collective dimension in theater which really is important, because it makes really you, in theater you can create we in a way that you can't create. Let's say visual art is in general is much more a question of individual, that you suscitate question, and of course you can also suscitate question about who my place as an individual in a we, that of course, but of course I think in the case of theater you can create a form of collective form of identification, but again I think what's important here is to create that by questioning them, making people to ask questions, and this is what makes it, but not by telling them, oh, this is how things are, pushing them to ask. This is what I think is also it refers to the question of Spinoza, the affection, putting them in circumstances in which the are going to spur question and spur desire. I think that's how I see the importance of what I call an agonistic form of art.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Unfortunately, our time is limited here, so thanks for your attention. And at the very end,